approach to using these herbs to help someone get through what's happening in their life on a mental level. You see? And then, of course, we have the occult purposes, which speaks for itself. And then also the spiritual element of hoodoo. You know, how this system of knowledge can help someone actually evolve along their path to their highest potential despite the conditions under which they're in. So those four things: the physical, emotional, psychological, occult, and the spiritual. Now, one of the other elements of this is the influence of the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, who were here before the Africans were brought here. You know, I mean, we have to remember that one of the other reasons that they even started bringing slaves to North America was because they were obliterating all the Native Americans. Like whole tribes actually wiped out, you know, in the course of manifesting destiny, you know. So there are some arguments about like, oh, you know, how much really comes from the Native Americans and so on. But we have to remember that initially, Native Americans were on a number of the same plantations as these blacks brought over from Africa. So with that opportunity, there was the place for this information and knowledge to be exchanged. And for those who were brought here to learn from the indigenous peoples and the knowledge that they had to share, and the indigenous people to learn and cooperate, you know, with the blacks that were here and brought here, especially when we're talking about uprisings. So on the plantation, you have these Native Americans that were still there again initially, that they were able to share their knowledge with, and through which the priests and those who were active in their spiritual tradition could communicate with the indigenous natives and have their, whatever their thoughts were on a particular plant and its uses, both physical or spiritual, and have that verified by a Native American source, someone who was versed in the physical and the spiritual components of the local flora and fauna. So there was that opportunity to actually have things verified based on what these Africans may have seen and recognized or seemed similar to something they knew from the continent, and have that verified by an indigenous individual, an indigenous source of knowledge here. Someone who could say, yes, it does act like that. Yes, it does have this effect upon the mind. Yes, it does. Yes, it can change this. Yes, it'll move that. Blah, blah, and so on and so forth. Or yes, it's a blood cleanser, and on and on. And we also find records of this later on, too, when we're talking about the actual medical component. And according to some records that exist, some of the very same things that Native Americans were known for using a particular plant for, we find that same knowledge, if not some of the exact same uses, amongst some of the slaves as well. So there was definite exchanges of knowledge happening. So yeah, the Native American component, the indigenous component, should not be neglected.
And so many of us, when we start looking at our ancestry, we see there's like Native American or, you know, African background, you know, in our own DNA. So you think, okay, why am I so interested in this, and why do I know about that? And so, you know, with the ancestors, that it all like just sort of is in your blood sometimes.
Yeah, quite literally, you know, and some of the, you know, there was the intermarriage that happened between blacks and Native Americans. You know, more and more knowledge about that, you know, is coming to the fore. Patrollers, you know, you had the indigenous peoples and certain tribes that would hide, you know, Africans that had escaped from the plantation, you know, and they would hide them from the patrollers, you know, and then if that person was living with them long enough, You know, you meet someone pretty and so forth, and then you have someone else that enters the world. And then through that, those that were half Native American, half Black African, and then the freedoms more or less they may have enjoyed in just being able to move around that enslaved peoples could not. And then so here you had literally this individual who was from both cultures, Native American, Black African, and could transfer that knowledge amongst these people more freely than someone on a plantation could. So again, not obviously not all this knowledge, you know, comes from Native Americans, but there is a definite Native American influence in the system of Hoodoo in terms of learning about local plants, how they can be used, and so forth. And so we have to give respect to that, and we should. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about was regions. And these three main regions, as broken down by an author named Hazard, Katrina Hazard. And I like to share this because I think it's very useful. So by the early 18th, 19th centuries, that's about when we had these three main kind of regions or roots for Hoodoo, or what will become Hoodoo in the United States. So I'm going to go through them now. So the first region being the Southwest. New Orleans, Gulf Coast, Mobile area.
Mobile is in Alabama? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that would encompass Western Florida, the Panhandle area of Western Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Eastern Texas, Missouri, and Tennessee. The Bambara tribe, which was from Senegal and Gambia, had a direct impact on what would be called Hoodoo, with some of the things that they introduced into the system just by being there. One of them being was called Gary Gary, which becomes Grigri. The Grigri. That comes from these people. You see? Other groups, other tribes that were in what's called Area 1 were such as the Yoruba and the Fon and the Ewe. Those that I mentioned earlier for the etymology of the word hoodoo itself, right? Region 2, Southeast, which is the Sea Island, Central and Coastal Georgia, and Florida. And that also encompassed Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina. And tribes there were from Sierra Leone, the Igbo tribe, and slaves from Central West Africa, or Congo and Angola.
So the ones from Florida, what tribe was that?
The main Florida,
You said
well, those are the ones from Sierra Leone
Sierra
and Igbo.
Leone.
And from Central and Western Africa.
So, since my father's from Florida, but the Africans brought in and deposited in Florida, he's probably from Sierra Leone tribes?
Could have been from around there. In fact, I know this for a fact. Yeah, Congo. At least as far as, you know, on your side, there's Ghana and there's Sierra Leone. Yeah, it's actually definitely there. I looked up some of the information I got through Ancestry.
Nice.
So, yeah, like I have actual numbers, you know, and where some of these folks come from. Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. One of them actually confirmed something. And also the ring shout that you see being connected to tribes from the Congo. So that ring shout that you'll see in some churches or in certain gatherings of Hoodoo practitioners comes from Congolese tribesmen. And even that was connected to them working around the cosmogram. Again, so once again, this cross, you know, crossroads. Even just by itself, the cross, even without even knowing about the cosmogram, just connecting the cross to the crossroads, you see? All these people were hung from a cross. The prophet Jesus Christ is hung from a cross, right? And then so hence the cross, him even being hung there becomes symbolic of the crossroad between life and death, heaven and earth. You see? Now the third region, Northeast, Maryland, and Chesapeake, Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, North Carolina, yeah, centered around Richmond and extending westward. And the tribes we have there predominantly being the Akan, Gold Coast slaves, and from Bight of Biafra. So we have one source for the possible origins of the word hoodoo coming out of region 1, and then we have in region 3 a source for the other possible origins of the word hoodoo with the Akan. So some of the other things that will influence hoodoo is region, you know, dress patterns, climate, speech, so on and so forth. These are things that would influence what would become hoodoo later on. One of the things that we can point to is like track gathering, right? Track gathering, where you're getting someone's footprint, you know, from the ground. Now later on, of course, as things get more industrialized, that obviously becomes harder to do. But, you know, as far as north and south in climate, you know, in the south that's easier to do, especially when we're talking about plantations, you know, because a lot of the folks out there were barefoot. But whereas in the north, you know, where it's colder and so on, people were wearing something, whether it be actual shoes or something that was supposed to operate as shoes. So things change. Clothing, personal concerns, you know, accessibility to that. The plants, obvious change. So something that someone would have been familiar with in the south, the southern plantation, in the north, they may have zero to no access to, or it simply may not exist at all. You know, then what do you do? You know, so it's looking at how the regions and the climate itself affected what would become hoodoo. Simply changing what people had access to. Yeah, so folks coming from the tropics, which presented its whole other kind of influencing factor on
As in
hoodoo
like
as well.
Jamaica and stuff? Or?
Yeah, in the Caribbean, you know, that was something that was actually quite unique, because slaves in the Caribbean or in the tropics had a significantly different situation than those here on the continent, with the exception of one to a couple other groups. And the reason for this is that, you know, in the islands, the slaves there had a lot more space, a lot more room to like literally breathe and begin or try and have some semblance of living, as opposed to here. There in the islands, especially depending on who owned that island, like the French for example, You know, the French would give their slaves space to actually practice their, like they would allow them to actually practice their religion. You're not seeing that here. You're not seeing that on the continent. But in like a French colony, they would actually allow them to engage in their religion. So that's one. Two, one of the other main factors was that as opposed to the continent, in the islands, whole families that had been abducted from Africa and brought over here were oftentimes allowed to stay together. Whereas here in North America, you were going to whomever the highest bidder was. You see? So you had more instances of whole families being able to be kept together in the islands than you did over here. So just based on those 2 points, you can see how the practice of African religion coming into the New World was allowed to maintain more of its original energy, focal points, philosophy, deities, practices overall in general. How that was allowed to be more maintained in that space and to a higher level of authenticity, if you will, as opposed to those here on the continent. And so later on I'm going to get to how that influenced what became known as New Orleans Hoodoo, but you know, that's very important to know, the distinctions, you know, in how, or rather the distinctions and the factors of what influenced Hoodoo, and how you can have these traditions, these ATRs, African traditional religions, in Haiti, in Jamaica, and so forth, and how they can also be so different than what's here on the continent, because they were allowed to maintain and keep a lot more of their original practices